Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Open Source Developers at Google Speaker Series. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Raf Levian, who will be talking to us about lessons from Advogado. Raf.
Thank you. Thank you so kindly. I am now at Google Incorporated. I have been here about a month, so I guess I should have brought my little propeller hat thing, which is a sign that I'm a noobler. I did Advogado about 8 years ago in 1999. And so I'm going to do something of a post-mortem in this talk. I'm going to talk about what Advogado is, what it was about, some of the goals, how well it met some of those goals. In some ways, it didn't do as well as I had hoped. And as I go through what Advogado is, I'm going to talk about some of the lessons that I've learned, some of the kind of take-home things that hopefully you can apply to other systems that do this kind of trust and reputation. These slides are going to be online. There's also video. I'm hoping some people will be watching. So there's lots of notes in the online version that you can refer to later. So what is Advogado? It really was motivated as a platform for testing out ideas on trust metrics or kind of distributed reputation. The original motivation, in fact, wasn't to build a blog-type community website system at all. It was to build a better DNS. It turned out that was a pretty hard problem. And I kind of got distracted by just the sub-issue of if you've got like a lot of users that are out there on the internet and you don't really know who they are, how can you define the edges of who belongs to the community and who doesn't? So I built the site around, I guess the first launch of it was in November of 1999. I had done some theoretical work before then and needed to test it out on real users. And what the actual site is pretty much blogs and articles, kind of a clone of Slashdot in some ways. One of the things that made it very different than Slashdot is that you have this social network graph, which is constructed with explicit UI interaction. So when you go to the site, then when you click on somebody else's profile, you get to certify them to say how much of a free software developer are they. These days, it has about 13,000 users, sort of a modest success. And as I said, it was really designed as a test bed for the trust metric ideas. So the whole motivation for building the site was this concept that I was exploring back in the late 90s of what I call attack-resistant trust metrics. And there are really two aspects of that, as the name would suggest. You've got a trust metric, which is about using the social network information to compute some information, some score of whether a person is trustworthy in some sense. And the thing that makes it, I think, unique compared with other systems in the same basic genre is the attack resistance. That you want to build a system that you can't just sign up and create a gazillion phony accounts and have those phony accounts influence the result of this trust metric computation very much. So you want to put some kind of bound on what a spammer can do. Microsoft had a paper basically saying, with different assumptions, you can't do this. That's the Sybil paper. But it depends on what your assumptions are. There aren't that many systems out there that are attack resistant. I mean, if you just add up votes or something simple like that, then it's not attack resistant at all. One of the things that's not exactly the same as Advogado in terms of the goals, the scope, but does have this attack resistance property is the PageRank algorithm that Google's used since the beginning to rank web pages. And that's worked out pretty well. It's actually, again, one of the surprising things of why are people not more interested in this? I mean, here you have an example, a research project that's modestly successful. You have a commercial implementation of a similar concept that's at least modestly successful. I think most people would agree is a pretty good system. And attack resistance maybe sounds more exciting than it is. That it makes it sound like it's this fortress, this wall that cannot be scaled, no matter how how strongly you want to scale it. And it's possible that the name has brought on some unrealistic expectations. And in fact, I'm going to show kind of the lesson slides in green here. One of the problems is that trust metric is a poor name. I mean, you say trust metric, and I really have some very technical meanings that are behind it. Trust is a very fuzzy concept. When you say trust in ordinary English, meaning, conversation, it can mean 5, 10 different things. So when I took on the word, I was really using the existing literature. PGP tried to create this thing, again, with the sort of original goals of building a better DNS, tried to build this thing called the web of trust. And that was really only modestly successful. But it certainly brought this idea of trust as something that can be computed into people's mind. And there were also a couple of important academic publications that were also using this word of trust to talk about some quantity that could be computed. So you had the really one of the first papers that kicked this line of research off, the Evaluation of Trust in Open Networks by Beth Borcherding and Klein, back in '94. It turned out that trust metric was completely broken and not attack resistant at all, but it kickstarted the field, I think. And then you had Matt Blaze's work on Policymaker and a couple of other related systems that he put under the rubric of trust management. He pointed out, that he was pitching these ideas to a lot of financial, types of applications, and he'd give a talk on trust management at a bank, and everybody would say, "But I thought this was supposed to be about administration of trust funds," But these days, if you do a Google search on trust management, you find a couple of those, but mostly things on the computational concept of trust. And as I said, I mean, what are you actually measuring? I mean, a few examples. You might trust a user to not spam. You might feel that their blog is worth reading. You might trust them with more things, like your wallet or your car keys or something like that. Advogado, just to kind of define the scope of this, that what actually got implemented really deals with exactly the first two questions on this list. Do you think the person's a spammer? And even if they're not a spammer, even if they're a real person, do you really want to spend your time reading their blog? And I really didn't get into the financial stuff at all. The word metric is also something with very specific technical meanings. And like the original work on this was a lot of it about monotonicity, that if you add more certificates, that you only increased trust. And that monotonicity is something that you find in metric spaces and so on and so forth. And again, that the term was really borrowed from the academic literature. Reiter and Stubblebine did a pretty good work on trust metric called metrics of authentication. These days, you wouldn't really call this authentication. Authentication is more about what OpenID does. Does this user correspond to their credentials? So they're actually, when you go a little deeper into the skin in Advogado, one of the things is that there are two different trust metrics that got implemented. And it's kind of important to understand the difference between these two. And I will be going into a lot more detail about that. So the original one is based on network flow as the underlying mathematics. And it has this very visible UI display that every user gets ranked as either Apprentice, Journey, or Master, or perhaps no certification whatsoever. And then there's another one that's a little bit more subtle that you don't even see unless you're logged in, that's based on eigenvectors, which is the same kind of underlying technology that PageRank and Clever use. And that computes something different. That computes this, how interesting is this blog measure. So they're both attack resistant. They have some characteristics in common, including the attack resistance, some things different based on the underlying math. And one of the big differences is that the original one only does positive information. I believe this person is a free software developer. That's the community that I'm defining. In the original trust metric, there is no way to say this person is not, or they're a spammer, or what they write is uninteresting. And in the second eigenvector-based trust metric, that does exist. There's a question?
Forgive my ignorance. What is eigenvector?
So eigenvector is a very fancy mathematical term that really talks about if you have a matrix that represents some kind of system like traversing web pages, that it really speaks to that system reaching a steady state. So it's talking about the underlying mathematics. So I'm not going to go into the details. There are more details in the papers. But kind of the takeaway thing is that there is a class of these things that's really been motivated by web search, like the PageRank that Google uses, like the clever algorithm out of IBM. They're all based on this eigenvector underlying mathematics. And really, that's what I'm saying, that this second trust metric is sharing some of that mathematical underpinnings. I actually did do an experiment where I tried to do a negative reputation system in Advogado, and it was an unmitigated disaster. I called the rating, in addition to these three, I called it dimwit. And it turned out that there were a lot of hurt feelings, and it just didn't meet its goals. But later on, it really became clear that you needed some negative reputation. So this gives you a little bit of an idea. I didn't make this figure. This is actually out of a PhD thesis worth reading by a guy named Kai Nicholas Ziegler, I believe is his name. And he actually did his own trust metric that was sort of a follow-on to this work and kind of compares the two. But just to give you a little bit of an idea that there's some pretty complex, sophisticated math under it. But I won't go into too much detail on that. Instead, I'm going to try and introduce these concepts by telling a story. And this is, what you're seeing here is actually the original motivating story behind this trust metric. And this story happened first, and then the site kind of got built second. So let's say that it's the middle of the Linux revolution. Linux is going to take over the world. And you're a book publisher, and you got a very specific problem. That you've got this book that every free software developer should have. And you also want to sell a lot of copies, so you don't want to give it away to everybody in the world. So you just want to give it to the people who are free software developers. And you want to draw this line of who is a member of this community fairly accurately. You can't do it by manual review. You can't have some person whose job it is to go out there and find all of the people in the free software community or something. That would be too expensive. And there's always people. I mean, the free software world is so diverse, so impossible to really put your finger on, that you're always going to miss some people. In this story, under these assumptions, and getting the assumptions right is really important, we're going to be OK with being a little too generous. We might say, you know what, it's totally fine if 10% of the people who sign up for this, it could be a book, it could be a little bit of free money, it could be conference pass, whatever. We're going to say, as long as it's bounded, as long as it's a relatively small fraction of what we're doing, that we're going to be OK with that. We're just going to say that's going to cost less than however much it would cost to get this information exactly perfect. But on the other hand, we're going to really try not to exclude people, because if we do, then they're going to write extremely angry blog postings about how the book publisher is not really as open and inclusive and so on and so forth as they'd like to be. So let's say, for the sake of the next few slides, that these are your assumptions. Now I'm basically going to tell you how you can solve this problem. So the first step is that you get a social network built. So really, you go out there to the free software developers, and you convince them all to sign up for accounts and put in their social network data of, essentially an arrow says, I know this person and I trust them. And step 2, I'm not so sure about. Step 3 is, of course, profit. So because we're giving away free books or free money or whatever it is, I mean, that's an assumption that we can make. That we're also going to make the assumption that there's going to be an attacker out there that is trying to break the system. And the theoretical work behind this really is based on sort of over the space of all possible attacks. How can you make a system that will still resist these kind of attacks, still not give away a million books or whatever? When I was making this slide, you can't like draw a picture of all possible attacks. That's just too complicated to think about, to reason about. So one of the things that I found, in the research phase of this, is that the attacks that work, the attacks that are really difficult to protect yourself against, are the ones in which you take the existing data that's good and you copy it. You make your own shadow copy of it, and then you basically put that into the system. Now, surprisingly, spammers have kind of learned that trick, and so it's quite common if you look at spam this or that you'll often see bits of copied text, bits of copied link structure. And so as the example that we're going to work through, again, at a very high level, I'm not going to go into the detailed math, but just to give you the flavor of where this attack resistance property comes from, we'll just use this example where I've taken the graph, I've made a copy, and then I've relied on a small number of gullible users who we will somehow trick into creating an edge saying that they trust one of these copied nodes. If you don't have any gullible users, then you're fine. The Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and all that. So what are some of the metrics that we can compute? I mean, there's lots of metrics. A metric is anything that you measure, basically. So you've got a lot of metrics that you could easily calculate over this thing, and some of which people have done some work to try and actually do. So you could count edges. You could say, this person must be really trusted because they have 3 edges coming in. They must be a very highly respected member of the community. The problem is this guy also has three edges coming in. There's no way that you can look at counting the number of edges or any kind of local statistic that you can compute on the graph. Because if you have a local statistic that you're computing on the graph, then the copy, the shadow copy attack, is going to look exactly like the real thing. There's no way to tell the difference. Another thing you can do that's a little different, that's global, is reachability. Are we reachable from the seed? Well, in this particular case, not so great because maybe I didn't draw all the arrows the right direction. But in general, once you get one gullible user, then the whole thing is considered reachable. Now, when I say kills you, I actually mean something very specific by that. What I'm talking about is the relationship between the cost of the attack. So I'm saying in order to get a gullible user to create an edge from the bad user to the good user is something that has a certain cost to it. And by kills you, I mean that you do a certain amount of work with a certain amount of cost, and then you fall off the cliff in terms of how much damage that you can create. That you can go in and sign in with your 1,000,000 spam nodes, and you can get your 1,000,000 free books given away. So a better metric, and one that you see, for example, all the time in social networking systems today, is this concept of distance from the seed. How many steps do I have to walk down this graph? And again, if you go back to the example, that you see we're going to do pretty well. As a matter of fact, if you only do things that are the seed, 1 step away from the seed, or 2 steps away from the seed, that will avoid getting the bad node altogether. We'll also exclude this guy. Too bad. And then if we take that reachability out 1 step further so that it's 3 degrees instead of just the 2, then in fact we'll get everybody. But we won't, and we'll also get this guy. The problem is then with this reachability style not reachability, sorry, the distance away from the seed metric, that you can then clone that 1 node and get unbounded number of nodes accepted. So in the story of the original assumptions of giving away free books, that's not good. So all you need is a gullible user that is near the seed, and you have the same falling off the cliff behavior where a relatively small amount of cost in the attack, creating 1,000,000 spam nodes is not considered costly. Having that edge from the gullible user is the part that's costly. So the answer, not surprisingly, is network flow. So this is the same graph as last time. It's sorted to be a little bit easier to figure out what's going on, perhaps, especially if you're colorblind. I kind of considered making that graph in black and white first and then making it in color, but I didn't want to be too mean. So again, I'm not going to go into the math here. It's very complicated, which is one of the reasons, I guess, why so few people have adopted this. But the inspiration here is really the sort of min-cut max flow theorem out of network flow theory, which says that, that if you compute the maximum flow over some network, that the quantity of that flow is equal to the minimal cut across the network. So you're really making the assumption that you can take this network and cut it across a fairly small number of edges from your good nodes to your bad nodes. And then you can actually prove very tight bound on the number of bad nodes that your trust metric is going to accept, that it is bounded by the amount of flow across that node. So the amount of flow across the edge from the gullible user to the bad users. So as long as you can keep that bounded, as long as you can keep the number of gullible users certifying bad users low, you can actually succeed and make this thing attack resistant in the sense that you can't just get your million free books given away. So I took this idea and I implemented it for something that wasn't at all in the same set of assumptions. Advogado is not a book publisher that is trying to give away a lot of free books. It's this kind of Slashdot-like community blog site with articles and blogs and so on and so forth. So what the actual implementation does is that it runs this trust metric that I just described with the network flow, and it uses the results as access control. If you get accepted by the trust metric, then you can post articles and you get you can edit anybody's project description, so it has kind of like a wiki-like functionality within this. So there are a couple of problems. I mean, the assumptions now are not quite matching what the architecture of the site does. That once you get a bad node, once you get accepted, you can post an unbounded number of articles. And another problem is, well, I have this thing where you can create a new account, and even without being certified, you can do lots and lots of spam. We'll get back to these. So the take-home lesson from this story is that you have to apply them correctly. Your assumptions need to match what the actual use of that trust metric is. So ideally, you've got, when I started this, the space of trust metrics known was pretty small, and that I was kind of blazing new trails in terms of coming up with ones that were attack resistant and had proofs of that. These days, you've got more work on it. Hopefully, you have this big, giant toolkit, this bag of trust metrics, and you can say there are different ones with different trade-offs and different amounts of being probabilistic or whatever, and you can just pick the one that matches your assumptions. If you can do that, then your chance of success is much better. You have to be thinking of, I gave that story about the relative cost of not giving a book to somebody who thought they deserved one versus giving too many away. Depending on, the cost of false positives and false negatives, totally depends on the application, and it's not, just some mathematical thing. Giving yes or no access control, basically saying chmod plus W, when somebody gets access, it's a bad thing. What you really want to do, if you can, is have the trust metric somehow correlated with the amount of damage that a person can do. So you want to make it so that there is no falling off of a cliff behavior, that if a person wants to post spam, they have to do a lot more. If they want to post 1 million messages, they have to do a lot more in terms of creating that attack than if they just did one. Another problem that I ran into is that, especially when you get people that are explicitly putting in their social network information, people don't read the instructions. A lot of people are reluctant. They don't want to make many nodes at all. So you actually get a fairly noisy graph. You can't make the assumption that this graph is going to be a high-quality piece of data. So you have to be aware of that. And I think these days there's kind of recognition of this fact. So Advogado is a dramatic success. The reviews are in. Bugs in Advogado. The trust metric system seems to be chock full of bugs lately. As a matter of fact, that is the top story on the site. And it happens fairly frequently. how much we trust the judgment of this might be, you might take into account how well they can spell. But in fact, there are a lot of comments that came in. Does everyone not agree that the trust metric is compromised? It's completely vulnerable to spamming. The system seems to be broken. So one of the take-home lessons here is that I didn't do a very good job of communicating what the trust metric was about, what the Advogado site was about, of the expectation. A lot of, when you read these complaints, a lot of them basically are that they don't really understand what this marvelous attack-resistant trust metric is supposed to do. And another consequence of that is that people don't just immediately say, oh, I want to deploy that on my site, because and if they ask me for advice, I won't say, oh yeah, just plug it in and go, because you have to do this kind of complex matching of what the trust metric actually does with the assumptions of the site, a matching that I didn't, at least in the early days, do very well on Advogado itself. And another thing that I think really hurt is that I didn't do as much academic publication on these ideas as I should have, because people really do look to that literature. So partly in response to the shortcomings of the first trust metric of Advogado, I built a second trust metric. And at heart, this is actually a very generic metadata engine that you can use to do music reviews and so on and so forth. And I wrote a how-to, and I said, I've been thinking about this more. I know what the limitations of Advogado are. I know the problems. You need something that can do these negative ratings. Somebody's blog is not interesting, worth reading. Here's my intellectual property. Go forth and implement it. And by the way, it's based on eigenvectors, so it's similar technologies, PageRank, different enough it probably doesn't violate the patent. That's not my official legal decision. That's just what I said in my paper that I wrote before I started working at Google. And I got almost no interest, almost no take-up on the idea. So I said, well, I have to go and implement it myself. So this thing, it has a lot of interesting features. It computes both a value and a confidence. And another interesting feature that differs from the original one is that it's a local view, that if you rank somebody's blog as really interesting, and somebody else says that blog is very uninteresting, well, you each get the benefit of your own view of that. And in fact, the people in the sort of clouds around you get their values of this weighted based on sort of closeness in the social network. So this thing works. And in this particular case, the assumptions really match reality very closely, that what you were putting into the metadata ranking system was how interesting is this blog, and what was coming out was a rating of how interesting is this blog. So I'll go to the demo now. We'll go into a little bit more detail. We'll test this. And let's see, you know what? I'm not logged in. So we'll do that. And OK. One consequence of this is that, or one specific feature of the implementation is that you really only see these rating values when you're logged in. So here's one. It's a 1 to 10 scale. And just looking at it at the top, that here's one that has a value of 3.7. And we see that he's writing about stuff that doesn't have a lot to do with free software. He's not a spammer, I don't think. But he's certainly not writing about free software a lot. And as you go through this, I encourage everybody to look for themselves. But you'll see, unfortunately, this gray is kind of, it's very hard. It's impossible to read. Yeah, apologies for that. That actually. Yeah, I'm trying to do that.
Control A. Control A, yeah.
Control A. It doesn't.
Say 79.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah. So this is.
Do you skin your website? Change the
yeah.
high contrast?
Yeah. This is actually supposed to be a feature rather than a bug, that it displays the really low confidence values, in very faded language.
But Avocado is chock full of bugs.
It is chock full of bugs. You're quite right. I should have done the demo on a blackboard, obviously.
Is it color-coded as to the...
Ah, yes. So I should probably, I kind of jumped into this a little bit, into the second trust metric a little bit too quickly, that the color coding reflects the rating of the user by the first trust metric. So purple is master level, blue is junior level, and green is apprentice level. And then if you see gray, then that's no certification at all. And in fact, people with no certification can still post on the recent diaries list. And you don't see very much of that. Most of the users are people who, certainly the frequent posters are people who have certifications. So in my experience, the people who get high values, like there's a threshold value here that's set at 3. Sort of anybody under 3 is probably a spammer or not doing what they ought to do.
So is this sorted by the trust metrics?
No, it's just sorted by date.
Could the user sort it by trust metrics?
So there's a lot of features that are not actually implemented in the site that have to do a lot with my bandwidth for implementing this stuff. And those are all things that are marvelous, and the code is out there, and you're more than welcome to implement that, but it's not done. This is not. I'm not really, advertising that the site itself is worth emulating. I'm trying to get the point across that it's about the trust metrics that are in it, and I filtered it here with a very high threshold of 9, and you'll find, I think when you look at it, that mostly now you're looking at blog posts that have to do with the programming and generally people that are pretty highly regarded in the community. Avocado is the new maintainer of the site. You have less sites, but it's perhaps a worthwhile way to read the site. And again, I encourage, so of the ones that you saw, it suppressed 87 entries as being below the threshold. And then if we look at them without the threshold, then you'll probably see some ones of very low. If you look at the ones that are sort of below 3, like this one is not in English. Maybe he's a free software developer, but he just hasn't convinced the rest of the community of that fact. And this guy, again, 1.6. And again, I have no idea. I can click on him and see what he's about, but he hasn't. He just mostly clicks links. He doesn't talk about programming. So that's a case where if you have your threshold set above that, then you're not going to see him at all. So I kind of gave a little demo that this second trust metric uses creates a filtered view. And I probably should have been more aggressive in implementing this thing, that you actually have to be logged in. Because it has this local, everybody is their own seed, you see your own view of the universe. There isn't a global concept as in the first trust metric. And the hardcore users of the site get a lot out of this. The people who are not casual users, and they're really just as important, don't get the benefit of this trust metric. So again, the details of the implementation really matter. So a couple of years ago, a new problem started coming up, and this is a very common problem. You see this all of the time in sites now. That when I first built the site, I really wanted it to be open. I wanted everybody who was a real free software developer to be able to sign up, create an account, get noticed from the writing of their diaries, their blogs, get the certifications, have a low barrier to entry. So I made it very open that you can sign up and create an account and post without needing any of this trust metric, sophisticated stuff at all. And I kind of knew that was a problem, that the thing was too open, and I always had the intent of closing that up as soon as it started getting abused. And in fact, in the early days, because it wasn't getting abused, then that kind of brought up this really strange question of, does this attack-resistant trust metric really work at all, or are people just not attacking the site? So thankfully, finally, people came along and started testing this. So these days, you don't even have to ask that question, that if you have anything that's worth anything, then it will attract the spammers and the attackers and the abusers. But in the early days, it wasn't quite so clear. So, the motivations behind the original design were to create openness, because a lot of people thought that even having a yes-no decision was too elitist, that it didn't match the ethos of the free software community. So that's what motivated the design. And it's now fixed. In fact, I didn't do this. I handed over the site about a year ago to Stephen Rainwater, who's the current Overlord. And hi, Stephen, if you're watching on video. And what he did is that he basically added a flag this account as spam. So maybe I can do an online demo of this. That we go into new Advogado members, of whom...
Do you want to see a spammer?
Yeah.
Try a recall. It's like M-I-K-L-A.
OK. Suggestion from the audience of...
No, that's the wrong one. Mikel. M-I-K-E-L.
OK. M-I-K-E-L.
That's the one.
Excellent. Cheap Viagra online links. So did you...
Well, I typed it. I've mistaken Nicole once.
I see. How long is this? Oh, my gosh.
Michael Brown, that's a popular name.
Yeah, it's a popular name. So I don't know why this person is still in the system, but...
That's because people flag your accounts as their own.
They flag new accounts. So one of the things that you can see here is that he has this link, but he hasn't been doing posting. If he were to post new diaries, then his account would come to people's attention, and then it would get flagged as spam. Not often enough, apparently. So I just clicked on the flag this as spam, and I increased the score from 3 to 6. And I got to do that because I'm certified as master. The actual amount of bump that I do to the spam rating depends on the level of certification. And so if another couple of people do this, 3 or 4 maybe, then it'll bump the score to 15, and then their account will be automatically deleted. And maybe I can... Beg your pardon? Well, he was one of the original wave of spammers. So we'll look at these people. It's fairly common. I don't understand it. Why people?
Mm-hmm. This crank has achieved to maintain status. Go back.
Okay, go back.
The Advocado has failed.
Ah, yes, right. Another excellent review.
Doesn't this prove that Avocado's trust metric system is a failure?
Yes, it proves that Advogado's trust metric system is a failure, and it is absolutely true. I mean, under the assumptions that this user brings to the system of what he expects this trust metric to do, it doesn't do what he wants to do. He expected it to keep out cranks. And very explicitly, that was not the goal. I mean, if you go back to that book example, that I'm totally okay with passing a few books out. And another thing is that in terms of the mismatch of the assumptions of the trust metric with the implementation is once you get your certification, once enough people say, well, maybe you're a little cranky, maybe your ideas are pretty good. That's the case in this particular example. That you can post as many articles as you like, and in fact, he was posting quite a few. So, it all has to do with, if I had come in and said, the purpose of this trust metric is to keep out cranks, then I would have had the way I would have implemented that is very simple. I would have had a metadata of this user is a crank, rate 1 to 10, and I guarantee you that the particular user that he linked here would have scored extremely highly on that score. It's an experiment that's well worth doing for future researchers that are out there. So, again, I can look in here that you get people, there's no links. There's nothing actually bad that this person has done except occupy space, on the new user list. If they did post, your typical spam link, then their spam, scores would have been increased.
Is there any way to undo what you just did?
So basically, there's no way for me. The question is there any way to undo what you just did? I don't have a user interface for undoing that. The idea is that if 1 or 2 people do it by accident, it doesn't really hurt anything. That's the threshold. And then if too many people do it, then yes, there's a manual process that the administrator can fish an account out of purgatory. But that's only been required, like once or twice. And in fact, the cases where that's happened, you can look at the account and you can kind of understand why the account got clicked on. I think there's more than one person with Asperger's who uses the site. If we had an Asperger's metric, then I'm sure that user would have scored extremely high on it as well. So, again, you kind of have to fish through to find, somebody who's doing really egregious spammy behavior. And if you look at the recent blog entries list, there's maybe one spammer on it, maybe not. It's an incredibly tiny amount of abuse, considering two parameters: how open the system is and how little admin work goes in. So yeah, there were a few cases of the overly zealous deletion, but it wasn't a big problem. And again, this was a good case of the assumptions pretty much matching the usage of the site, that the amount of damage that you can do by falsely flagging as spam is somehow related. If you get one or two people that come in and then want to poison the, get their certificate and then want to poison the spam scores, they could, but it probably wouldn't bring it over threshold. It wouldn't really bring the whole system down. So this is really something that's worked. Question?
So how many times can one person go in and mark somebody's blog as spam?
So the question is, how many spams can one person mark as this blog is spam? And at the moment, there's no bound on that.
So you could go into the same person and mark them as spam numerous times.
So the question is, can you go in and mark the same person as spam? And the answer to that is no.
That was my question.
OK, I thought you were saying how many different people can you mark as spam. Right, so you do have this kind of limiting behavior where your ability to do damage, where you can say, I want to mark this person as spam because I don't like them, that your ability to do that is fairly limited. And we haven't seen that particular abuse happen.
Unless you can coerce other people to.
So the question is if you can coerce other people to do that, and that's absolutely true. So the idea is this is what attack resistance means. Attack resistance does not mean that the system is completely proof against any attack, that there's impossible to make these things happen. It means if you want to do that, you have to do more work. You have to increase the cost of your attack, where you're doing stuff like convincing other people to send in those flags. Once you've reached that level of being able to pull off that attack, then there's no hope. Fortunately, we're not seeing that in the real world just yet. We're in good shape. So one of the other take-home lessons that I want to get across, because I think this one has a lot more relevance in terms of other people implementing these kind of systems, is that transparency and openness really works, or at least this is an instance of transparency and openness really working. All of the details, all of the secrets of how the system keeps out spam, if you're thinking like, how would I go into the system and make it accept my spam? And the page rank is very high. It's very worthwhile to get spam into this system. Are completely public. You can just go in, read the code, figure it out. And the system is also very open, almost as open as the day that it was created. It really isn't about creating barriers and saying it's going to be very difficult because of all of our spam filters that you need to get around. And also, a very small amount of manual work, which is not something that you see when you look at the site. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between something that's inherently spam resistant and an army of deletion monkeys behind the scenes. So in security, in cryptography, a lot of companies try and achieve security through obscurity. And in the security world, in the cryptography world, that gets you laughed out of the room. And I think, without, again, Advogado is one data point, that's probably true in the world of these reputation systems as well. That ultimately, if you have to keep the details secret to think that you're secure, it probably isn't. So again, Avocado is a modest success. It did some things well, other things not so well. It didn't really catch people's attention on fire. So why, if it works so well as I'm saying, why isn't everybody using it? And like everything else, there's probably a combination of lots of different reasons. The code base itself, I'm a programmer, so when I wrote this, I wrote it in my most comfortable language, which is C. And you would never do that. Please, if you write something like this, then please write it in Python. I didn't publish enough. I didn't do enough self-promotion. I'm here doing this talk. I think that helps. But in retrospect, if I really wanted to push these ideas out there, I could have done a lot more of that work. And then, as I say, that if you just look at the site, it's very difficult to tell how much of it is really the inherent properties of the site, and how much of it is somebody sitting behind the scenes making it look a lot better than it really is. But the good news is that people are starting to care now. I mean, this talk is one of maybe a half dozen that some internal, some external at Google on reputation, social networks, et cetera. It seems to be that people understand that the social network is powerful, and spammers are powerful, and hopefully the social network is more powerful, but that's where the battle is taking place. And I'm fortunate that I'm a member of the Comment Abuse Tools team here. I'm working on these things. And I'm really happy because, I think a lot of people's goals are now aligned. I'm interested in solving these problems. Users are interested in not having to fight spam. And of course, there's a real bottom line impact for Google as a money-making entity in terms of whether these are well-functioning products or whether they're infested with spam and abuse. So I think that's my talk. Let me see. Yes, that's it. So I'm really happy to take questions or from the back.
So you built those systems. Some of it applies to an open system or multiple goals on different sides.
So the question is that I built this as a closed system that really, everything working on a single server. And could I have deployed it as a highly decentralized system? And the answer to that is absolutely. That was really the original goal. The original goal was to build something that wasn't a broken DNS, that wasn't depending on kind of the VeriSign at the top of the hierarchy. And the reason that I built it as a single closed site is that it was much simpler to do that, and that I kind of wanted to separate out the possibilities of failure, that it's entirely possible that all of the ideas were really good, but I just didn't know how to build a widely distributed system well. These days, you have distributed authentication mechanisms as opposed to distributed trust, like the OpenID talk that was earlier today. Again, one of the series. And I think that that making this thing scale up is one of the more interesting, sort of future research directions to take it. Madhukar? So absolutely. So the question was, does the fact that this work have to do with the particular domain that I picked of the discussion of being open source programmers, which maybe, according to the kind of implicit assumption of the question, are not as contentious as other? I'm not sure that's true. And I think the answer to that is that when you look at the population of the spammers and abusers, they're posting links on Viagra. So I think you're going to see more or less the same spam and abuse no matter which population of legitimate users that you pick. So it's hard to know the answer for sure until you actually do it. But my gut feeling is that the success, as so much as you've seen it, is not just due to the nature of the domain. Ken?
Do you think that would be equally true if it was more contentious metric in saying, are they going to open source, which is at least probably something you can agree on, whereas do I agree with them politically or something would be a different thing. You may end up with multiple joining metrics.
So I'm supposed to repeat the questions, and that was a little complicated. But it basically, let me see if I can get the gist of it across. That if you had a domain that was more contentious, would you want to have multiple different kinds of metrics that were being ranked other than just how interesting is this person's blog? Is that the gist of the question, or?
If you've got something politically contentious, then we will end up with people's. If you look at the blogosphere now, there's clusters of right-wing blogs and left-wing blogs.
Right.
They disagree on everything but link to each other blog.
Yes.
They're arguing.
Okay.
So there's some valuation for being contentious. That the attack is a publicity attack, where you see
Publicity attack
that stirs people up.
from being contentious. So I guess the answer to that question is that Advogado does not, because it's just not in one of these politically contentious spaces, that as an experiment, it doesn't really answer that question. That said, there is a lot of really interesting work out there that if you look at the clever algorithms that were done by Joe Kleinberg at IBM Research that later became part of the Teoma search engine, that they actually started looking at the second eigenvectors and third eigenvectors of the matrix, of the link adjacency matrix of the web. And one of the examples out of their paper that I thought was really fascinating is that if you look at the second eigenvector on a search of abortion, that you'll see this really clean separation into sort of, pro-life, pro-choice camps. That you could, just by looking at the link structure without doing any kind of semantic analysis or any kind of self-identification as one camp or the other, that just looking at the link structure, you can extract that. So my gut feeling is that if that data is interesting, if that is what you're trying to extract out of a social network, that the data is there, that the tools, the techniques actually can bring a great deal of power to that question. But as far as did Advogado answer any of those questions, then no, it did not. That was not part of the scope of the experiment.
So how often you update these eigenvectors?
How often do I update the eigenvectors? I believe that calculation is every 4 hours, but it sort of depends on load and so on and so forth. That's an implementation detail that is kind of less interesting to me personally. The question is it computationally expensive? So the answer is that in the implementation as it exists now, it's not so much computationally expensive. The bottlenecks happen to be getting the data in and out of the database, which, because I sort of drank too much of the XML Kool-Aid, is all XML files in a flat file system, and that's very inefficient. And the other thing that makes that more expensive than it should be is that it's actually calculating the local view of all 13,000 users in the system, that it's computing different scores. If I see something that's a 9.3, then somebody else might see it as a 4.1. And actually, in response to an earlier question, that if you do have something that's contentious, if you do have a thing with kind of wars of people within one cluster ranking down somebody in the other cluster, then what you would expect to see is you would expect to see this local this locally relevant score, which again is relatively expensive, and as the system scales up, then the cost of computing that becomes unrealistically large. And you would need to do things like figure out clusters and so on and so forth. But again, that was one of the nice things about this, that I had a modestly successful as opposed to runaway successful system, so it was very practical for me to do this experiment on a site with only 13,000 nodes. I certainly won't have that luxury here at Google. Any other questions? OK, well, thanks very much for coming out. I really appreciated being able to give this talk.